Hello, welcome to video number 5 in the FUME tutorial series. This time we're going to look into references and related functions. If you remember, we had a primary doctor here in our example, for which we had a full name and a license. And in the first video, what we did was just put the license as an identifier in the reference, which is inside instance of patient. The element was general practitioner. So a better thing to do will be to query my FHIR server and search for a practitioner resource that has this identifier. Instead of just using a logical reference using an identifier, I want to use a literal reference. So here's what we're going to do. So inside general practitioner, let's start with putting the identifier anyway, because maybe if we search the FHIR server we don't find a matching resource, so at least we still have a fallback, so we still know what the business identifier of the practitioner was. So that would be identifier value, which equals primary doctor dot license. Okay, so that would be our fallback. And now let's see if we can find a resource. So the element is named reference, and the function we are going to use is literal. Literal because we're trying to convert a logical, a conditional reference into a literal reference. Now, a conditional reference is like a search query. So let's start by making a conditional reference, and then we will wrap it with a literal function. So a search query for this doctor would look something like this. The resource type, question mark, identifier equals, and then I'll concatenate the license number. So now I have a conditional reference. In some scenarios, you might want to just leave it as is and post it to the server and let the server resolve the conditional reference. But in other scenarios, you might want to do it before. When you transform the data, you want the reference to be literal already. Maybe because the server doesn't support conditional references, or maybe because you want to fail the transformation in the case that your query returns more than one resource. This is something that the FHIR standard defines as an error for resolving conditional references, and instead of leaving it to the final stage where you post to the server, maybe you want to handle this error at the transformation stage. So let's wrap it with the literal function. All right, so as you can see, our search query was replaced with a literal reference. So that means there is a resource with a practitioner resource with this license number, and it is only one. If I had two, that would be an error, and I'll show you this in a minute in a different scenario. So that's a reference, and maybe we also want to check for the patient, because maybe this patient already exists in the server, and in that case we want to update it and not create a new one. And for that we would want the patient ID. So I have this MRN here, and I have the social security number. So let's see what happens if I use either. So if I want to set the patient ID, that would be the instance. And let's see, if the patient exists, I want the instance ID to be the same as the resource that exists on the server. So for that, I have a function called resource ID, and it gets a search query, just like the literal. So let's start by defining the function, calling the function. That would be resource ID, and say patient whose identifier equals MRN. I've got an error, and the error message says the search, and this is the search query, returned multiple matches. Criteria is not selective enough. So what I can do is change the criteria to be more selective. In our case, I happen to know that the social security number has no duplicates. Maybe the MRNs are duplicates because we converted patients from multiple systems into the same FHIR server, and then we have collisions on the MRN because two systems created the same MRN for different patients. So if I know that the social security number is more unique in my system, then I may just use that instead of the MRN. And there we go. We have a GUID here, a UUID, which is the actual resource ID of the patient that returned from this query. So now I can put this into the server and just update it and not create a duplicate. So this is also related to a reference. The difference is actually very easy. The literal function returns the URL. So it starts with the resource type and then the resource ID. The resource ID function returns only the resource ID. So I think that would be all for this video. Thank you. See you next time.